December 14, 1944, 6:27 hours. A temporary American holding camp, somewhere in the Ardennes. Frost clung to the canvas walls like thin white breath. Boots crunched on gravel in a steady, measured rhythm. Diesel fumes drifted low, mixing with the smell of soaked wool and cold metal mess tins. The camp was half awake, lamps glowing weakly, soldiers muttering, a distant generator coughing to life. Inside one of the storage huts, a woman sat on a wooden crate, her uniform hanging loosely from a body thinned by weeks of rationing and fear. She did not know the date. She barely knew the time. What she knew, what she braced for, was the knock. It came. Hard, sharp, military. She squeezed her eyes shut. Expected shouting. Instead, the first word she heard was, "Please." A contradiction so quiet it felt like a mistake. They screamed at the knock, and wept over a cup of tea. The soldier who stepped inside wore the dust of marching and the calm expression of someone who had seen too much to waste emotion. He was American, young, but with the kind of tiredness that made his face seem older in the half-light. He held a canteen and in his other hand a folded blanket. He wasn't supposed to give either. The woman flinched, pulling her arms tight around herself as though bracing for inspection, punishment, something. Instead, the soldier knelt to her level. He set the canteen on the floor gently, like a fragile object. "No one's going to hurt you," he said softly. She shook her head, not in refusal but disbelief. Her lips were cracked. She licked them, tried to speak, failed. He waited, something not often afforded to any prisoner, let alone an enemy one. She stared at the canteen. He nudged it closer. "Go on," he said. When she finally reached for it, slow, trembling as if expecting it to be snatched back, his voice lowered again. "You're safe now." For the first time in days, her hands stopped shaking. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The woman had been captured 2 nights earlier, pulled from the remnants of a shattered column after an artillery barrage scattered units across the forest. She was one of several auxiliary workers, communications, clerical, non-combat, swept into a retreat they hadn't been prepared for. The offensive had collapsed around them like a burning curtain, and when the American patrol found survivors wandering in the dark, she could barely stand. There was no resistance left in her. Only hunger, cold, and the instinct to follow the nearest voice that didn't sound like thunder. She became a POW the way many did in those final months. Suddenly, quietly, almost accidentally. Transport to the camp was a blur she would later remember only in fragments. The jolt of a jeep on frozen ruts, headlights slicing through mist, the rough wool of a borrowed coat pressed to her cheek as she drifted in and out of exhaustion. She remembered the smell of gasoline, the low murmur of American soldiers talking over her head, the startling warmth of the heater inside the command truck that met them halfway. Compared to the chaos she'd fled, the ride felt impossibly orderly. She watched their faces when she could lift her head, their guarded professionalism, their discipline, the way they moved with unspoken rules. No one touched her unnecessarily. No one shouted at her. No one seemed interested in humiliating her. It confused her more than cruelty would have. By the time they reached the temporary holding camp, dawn was a pale smear on the horizon. Someone handed her a tin cup of weak coffee. Someone else directed her to a bench inside the storage hut. An American sergeant took her name, asked no unnecessary questions, and wrote her number on a slip of paper with a pencil worn down to the metal. The camp was cramped, makeshift, imperfect. But it was not a place of torment. And that alone felt like an impossible luxury. The first real moment, the pivot, the memory she would never escape, came that same morning when the young soldier returned. He brought food. A ration tin warmed over a stove. Hard biscuits softened in broth. Even a sliver of chocolate tucked into one corner of the tray. She stared at it as if it were an artifact from another world. The soldier held the tray steady. She hesitated. He said nothing this time. Just waited. Her hands rose, slow, fragile, disbelieving. She lifted the spoon. The first bite made her eyes close, as though her body couldn't handle the shock of tasting something real. Her breath hitched. Tears followed. Quiet, sudden, unstoppable. He set his cap on the bench beside him, folded his hands and looked away out of respect. When she finally managed to speak, her voice cracked like thin ice. "Why?" His answer was simple. "You're cold. You're hungry. That's enough." Later in her diary, found decades after the war in a box of keepsakes she never discarded, she wrote, "I feared the first blow. Instead he gave me warmth. It is a strange thing to be rescued by someone you were told would despise you. War makes cruelty easy. Civilization makes restraint difficult. But restraint had its advocates. A memo stamped War Office, 1940, read simply, "Prisoners are soldiers, not slaves." Those 6 words shaped every Allied camp from Scotland to Kansas. Security, diplomacy, morality. 3 principles that guided how the United States and Britain handled the hundreds of thousands of POWs who passed through their custody. Food was rationed, not weaponized. Medical care was obligatory. Abuse was prosecutable. And violence, while never absent, was not policy. Civilization under pressure is measured not by what it destroys, but by what it refuses to destroy. Daily life in the camp was a sequence of routines designed to maintain order. Roll calls at dawn, distribution of meals at set hours, scheduled work details when weather allowed. The women were assigned light tasks: folding laundry, sorting supplies, mending uniforms. Nothing punitive. Nothing humiliating. The American guards rarely raised their voices. Some barely spoke at all, communicating with hand gestures, nods, brief instructions. Their power lay in structure, not intimidation. Meals arrived in metal carts pushed along muddy paths. The air smelled of boiled potatoes, canned meat, and smoke from the potbelly stoves inside the barracks. The women lined up silently, each receiving her portion, each surprised, again and again, by the simple fact of being fed. Fear eroded slowly like frost melting off a roof. Eventually, small revelations emerged. One guard brought a harmonica and played in the evenings, soft tunes drifting through fog. Another passed around old newspapers for those who could read English. A chaplain visited weekly, offering quiet words without judgment. The soldiers enforced rules, yes, but rules were predictable. Predictability was a kind of mercy. For many of the women raised on propaganda about Allied brutality, the consistency felt unreal. A woman in her late 20s, formerly a clerk in a field headquarters, struggled with chronic coughing from weeks of exposure. The American medic checked her lungs with practiced efficiency, then handed her a small tin of menthol balm. "Rub this on your chest at night." She stared at the tin. "Why give this to me?" she whispered. He shrugged. "Because it helps." In her diary she wrote, "I had forgotten what ordinary kindness looked like." Another woman, barely 19, kept to herself, knees drawn to her chest whenever she sat. One evening, a guard noticed she could not open her ration tin. Her hands were too numb from the cold. Without a word, he set his rifle against the tent pole, knelt, and opened it for her. She murmured, "Danke." He nodded once. "You're welcome." Later she wrote, "A single gesture can undo a month of terror." A middle-aged woman, once a factory supervisor, fixed a broken hinge on one of the barracks doors. The guard who supervised her work asked, "How'd you learn that?" She replied, "During the shortages. The men were gone." The guard chuckled, shaking his head. "You people know how to make do, that's for sure." She wasn't sure if it was a compliment, but it was the first time she felt spoken to as a person rather than a number. Her diary line read, "He talked to me as though peace were already here." In time, ideology itself began to fracture. What the women had been told about the Allies, that they were monsters, violators, destroyers, faded in the face of lived reality. But replacing propaganda with trust was slow, uneven. One rainy afternoon, the young American who had brought the starving woman her first bowl of broth sat with her outside the barracks. He lit a cigarette, offered her one. She declined. He nodded, took a drag, exhaled into the cold air. He reached into his pocket and held out something small. A photograph. A family. Parents. A sister. A dog lying at their feet on a porch. He didn't speak. Didn't need to. She leaned closer and felt something shift inside her. Not affection, not allegiance, but humanity. The barrier between enemy and stranger cracked, just enough for warmth to seep through. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. Winter deepened. Snow came in heavy, wet sheets that blurred the edges of the camp and softened the hard angles of the wire fences. The stoves burned longer. The guards walked with scarves covering their faces. The women huddled and shared blankets, not out of order, but out of necessity. On Christmas Eve, a chaplain organized a small service. No one was required to attend, but many came. Americans on one side, prisoners on the other, all standing beneath a sky so dark it felt like velvet. A lantern swung gently in the wind above them. The chaplain read a passage about peace. Someone hummed a hymn. The melody was fragile at first, then steadier as voices joined, multiple languages blending into something that sounded less like worship and more like breath. One of the women cried silently. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps because the sound reminded her of home. Perhaps because it reminded her that home was gone. But it was the young soldier's presence beside her, silent, respectful, hands clasped loosely, that steadied her. The hymn ended. Snow fell. For a moment war paused. Only a moment, but long enough to remember that pauses are possible. By early spring transfers began. Camps shifted as front lines changed. Some women were moved to larger facilities in the interior. Others were repatriated under special circumstances. The anonymous woman was among those scheduled for transport. She received a change of clothes, simple, clean, marked only with her POW number. She folded them carefully, almost ceremonially. Her old uniform lay in a heap on the floor, a relic from a life that no longer felt real. Outside, the young American soldier waited beside the truck. He held a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For you," he said. She blinked. "It's nothing much. Just thought you might want it." She opened it slowly, her breath catching when she saw the contents. A wool scarf. Hand-knitted. Dark blue. She touched the fibers, unable to speak. He looked down at his boots. Cleared his throat. "You made it this far," he said. "Make it the rest of the way." She nodded, tears threatening again. This time she allowed them. The truck engine rumbled to life. She climbed aboard, seating herself among the other women. The soldier stepped back, raising a hand in farewell. Not a salute, not an order, just a gesture that belonged to no nation. The truck rolled forward. She held the scarf to her face, inhaling the faint smell of soap and wool, and whispered to herself, "He saved me without needing to." Some POWs returned home immediately after Germany's surrender. Others remained for months while arrangements were made. Many women, especially auxiliaries and forced conscripts, blended back into a society too shattered to ask questions. A few wrote letters to their former guards, simple notes of thanks. Some left gifts, drawings, handkerchiefs, small tokens of gratitude. One woman sent a photograph of her family, newly reunited, with a caption, "I survived." By 1947, thousands of POWs who had spent time in Allied custody described their treatment as fair, humane, even kind. A significant number requested delayed repatriation so they could continue earning money or finish contracted labor. Their memories varied, of course. War is never gentle. But many carried with them one or two moments, quiet, fragile acts that contradicted everything they had been told. For the anonymous woman, that moment remained the young soldier in the storage hut, kneeling with a blanket and a canteen. She lived a long life. She married. She had children. But she kept one object until her death, folded, preserved, never discarded. The blue wool scarf. Years later, when her family discovered her diary, they found only a few sentences about him. "He did not free me. He did not know me. But he restored something. Not kindness, restraint. Not affection, mercy. Which is perhaps the core of it. Sometimes civilization survives because one person chooses not to abandon it." If this story changed how you see the fragile line between war and humanity, subscribe. There are more chapters we must not forget. The war had taught them fear. The peace taught them mercy.